Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our NEA Big Read One City, One Read Kick-Off. We are super duper excited for tonight's conversation, the kickoff to One City, One Read season. This year, we are highlighting Sitting Pretty, A View from Our Resilient, Ordinary, Disabled Body by Rebekah Taussig. Um, this evening's program, we will hear from the amazing Marlene Sallo. She is the director of the National Disability Rights Network. And we have our very own Gretchen Knopf, who is the director from the Department of Services of Persons with Disabilities for the City of New Haven. And a little bit later on in the broadcast, I myself had the pleasure of interviewing Rebekah Taussig, the author of Sitting Pretty. I'm just super excited for this evening. I hope you all stay tuned. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. You never know who you might see in the chat from the broadcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please stay tuned to learn more information about our upcoming One City, One Read events. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gretchen Knopf. I am the director of the Department of Services for Persons with Disabilities for the City of New Haven. Welcome. I am a member of the Big Read Committee for 2023 and have been assisting in the planning of this for about a year now. I'm very excited to join the Festival of Arts and Ideas and bringing you this kickoff and a number of different events that we'll be having throughout the city. I hope that you will be joining us for many of those. Today, it is my great pleasure, my honor, to introduce to you Marlene Sallo. She is the director of the National Disability Rights Network. They are the membership network for the protection and advocacy system in the United States, and the protection and advocacy agencies advocate for the civil and human rights of people with disabilities. I'm going to have Marlene introduce herself and tell you a little bit about who she is, and then we'll jump into a few questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with everyone today. I'm sorry I couldn't speak to everyone live, but as Gretchen indicated, I'm the new executive director for the National Disability Rights Network. I've been here about 5 months, but I'm not new to the disability rights community. I have worked within the Protection and Advocacy Network for years, leading the Massachusetts Protection and Advocacy Agency for almost 4 years, and also serving as an education attorney with the Florida PNA. My background is civil rights, and disability rights is civil rights. And I have dedicated my career, whether serving as a special education teacher or working within the criminal justice system, advocating for the rights of youth with disabilities in both the foster care and juvenile justice system, always making sure that any services that they needed or any modifications to their education were being provided as part of their IEP. So disability rights has been front and center in everything I've done throughout my career, and now more so than ever, leading the way for NDRN across the U.S. and throughout all of the U.S. territories. And as I indicated before, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. We are, as you know, reading a book called Sitting Pretty by Rebekah Taussig. And so I thought it was important to have you come on and talk a little bit about why it's important to talk about people with disabilities.
Oh, very good question. So I don't know if folks are really aware of the statistics, but 1 in 4 Americans have a disability, whether it's visible or invisible. And so I don't believe that on a regular basis, individuals working in different arenas like employment law or fair housing, even healthcare, are really take into account how many of us within the disability community are part of the individuals that they serve on a daily basis. And so it's important for people to realize that if you don't have a disability early on in your life, sooner or later you may acquire a disability, especially with age, as we age. And so making sure that we are aware that we are not othered, and that we are not viewed as less than because we have a disability is so very important. And we need to continue to bring this conversation to the forefront. And we need to be able to understand that whenever any issue is being discussed, individuals with disabilities should be front and center in all conversations. And each and every one of us should have a seat at the table, because anything that affects a non-disabled person also affects a disabled person. And so therefore, we need to have these discussions on a regular basis and raise awareness to everyone throughout all walks of life.
So well said. Especially the fact that the statistics keep growing in the percentage of people with disabilities. Just like 5 years ago, it was 1 in 5, but the population is aging. So can you tell us about some of the discrimination? And I know this is a long topic you and I could talk about for a while, but that's still faced by people with disabilities today, because I think that people have this perception that because of laws and things, and that people with disabilities don't face the same types of discrimination.
I often, even in discussions that I have with my adult children on a regular basis, I like to raise awareness about how discrimination could be so glaring and maybe not so glaring. So think about when you go to see a physician. Examining tables, the height of examining tables. If I'm a wheelchair user, or if I have some sort of mobility problem, those examining tables are difficult for me to be able to get on and off of. And so that's one thing to consider. Voting, we saw this front and center, right, in the most recent cycle, a presidential cycle, when we were all going through COVID, which had a deleterious effect on our community. And we had states saying, well, you got to show up, you got to stand in line. We're going to join some of the voting places into one building because we can't have people throughout the county. But we have individuals who are immunocompromised or who are very fearful of their health not being able to show up, and so they're asking to vote online. And some communities are not allowing that. Some states are not allowing that. And although during COVID, many states were able to get passage of temporary laws or rules, um, and allow folks to vote electronically or to vote by mail, not every state has stuck to that. And that's discriminatory as well. We had folks saying, okay, you're going to vote by mail, so you need to print the paper, you need to fill it out, put it in an envelope, and mail it. But if I have, manual or dexterity difficulties, I may not be able to hold a pen. I may not be able to stuff an envelope. So right there, I'm being disenfranchised. And that's discriminatory against our community. We also have within some of our community members, they don't have access to competitive and integrated employment. And so we still have states where individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are working in employment area, have employment where they're earning less than the minimum wage. And that's acceptable because of a 14C certificate, right, that the employer may have. And then we also think about housing. Are the apartments that are available to the public, how many of those apartment buildings are accessible? How many of the office buildings in town are accessible? How is our public transportation system meeting the needs of people with disabilities? How accessible are they? And so on a daily basis, we are encountering inaccessibility throughout our communities that is discriminatory against people with disabilities. And it's also discriminatory to have individuals assume that because you have a disability, you're unable to do something. You are unable to fully participate um, in the day-to-day activities. You are unable to be out and about in the community. We are not less than, and it is so important for people to understand that on a regular basis.
I I sat here and I just kept ticking off all of the issues that I have talked about in the last week. You named them all. Uh, this morning, it was somebody who is being undervalued in a job and, in fact, discriminated against. We still have 14C here in Connecticut, which is highly discriminatory. Voting is a huge issue for me. I've always been an advocate for the voting rights of people with disabilities, just and housing. So you'll see all of these same issues in New Haven and all around the state. We're a small state, so we collaborate with each other, and you see these medical diagnostic equipment not accessible. And there's really, no great enforcement, although it's a requirement under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we really didn't talk about this, but I just was totally taken aback. That was so you can see that it's a pervasive problem. It's not just here, it's everywhere. So I have one last question for you. How can we be more welcoming to people with disabilities as individuals? How can we as individuals be more welcoming to people with disabilities? And how can we as a society be more welcoming to people with disabilities?
Humanity. We just need to be kind to one another. I get so caught up in this because, like I said before, don't assume, like, some of us have invisible disabilities. I, for one, have an invisible disability, right? And so the assumption is that I might be able to do everything under the sun. And, my disability doesn't allow me to do some things. And so if you see someone acting a certain way that you're not used to seeing them act that way, like, don't automatically assume, like, what's wrong with you? Like, and be gruff about it. I'll use a perfect example. Like, I can't turn my neck a lot because I have 10 screws in my neck and metal plates. And I was in a job and someone came from behind me. And so I had to turn my entire body to be able to see them. And the person uttered a bad word and was like, "What is wrong with you? Like, why is that appropriate to, like, speak to someone like that?" And so we just need to show grace. We need to understand that, someone to your left or right may have a disability that is not visible to you. And it's none of your business whether it is or not. We just need to treat each other with grace and kindness, because whether the disability is visible or not, humanity calls for that. We're all going through a lot right now. We don't need, some added tension because someone that's within your circle happens to have a disability and needs an accommodation. Accommodations are there so that the person can enjoy the activity as at the same level that you can, right? And so just be kind about it, and be welcoming to all of those that may not act like you and may not, look like you, but they're human just as much as you are. And, kindness. We just need to be kind to one another.
And I kind of look at it as the golden rule: treat others as you would want to be treated yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And society wise, I think that, when you're planning or doing anything, you've got to have people with disabilities in mind because there's such an intersectionality to disability that it's important that we plan for disability related eventualities ahead of time. And that's what the law is really requiring anyway.
Right. So why not use plain language, right? When you're creating a document, why not be cognizant of the fact that some people are colorblind? So think about the colors you're using on your website. Think about, the fonts that you're using in your materials because, someone may have a visual impairment and those fonts really mean a lot. So it's really being cognizant of the needs of everyone around you and not just the folks that you on a regular basis interact with. And so, educate yourself. There's lots of books to read and resources online to just figure out how can I be more inclusive of everyone in my day-to-day activities.
Absolutely. And if you're a member of a DEI committee, remember that people with disabilities are included in DEI. I think that's left off a lot. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that we're doing as a society is saying DEI, 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 and it stops before you get to disability. It should really be disability or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Because then when you belong, somebody's valued your input.
Yes, and we go even a step further. So diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging.
Of course. Well, belonging to me definitely includes
Yes.
accessibility. But
But
you know what? I like that. I'm going to add it.
yeah, some folks don't really make that connection. And so, just to take it a little over the edge, we'll also include accessibility for those that don't see it like you and I see it, Gretchen.
Okay, I'm going back to the Chamber of Commerce and asking them to add, hey, there we go. Well, Marlene, I've taken up enough of your time. I really appreciate you being with us. It was really a treat to talk with you and to get your perspectives. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. And good luck with everything, all the events.
I am so excited to introduce Rebekah Taussig, the author of Sitting Pretty, A View from My Resilient Ordinary Disabled Body. Rebekah, us here in New Haven have just been so delighted about this book and just so excited to finally have a chance to talk with you, to let you know kind of what we're doing here in New Haven. Um, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, about the book, how it got started? Girl, you can tell us everything.
Here we go. All right. Thank you for that introduction, Sean, and thank you for inviting me here for this chat. And to everyone who's reading the book or maybe will read the book, whatever, wherever we're at in the reading process. But yeah, what can I tell you? I think once a person writes a book, people often ask you why did you write that book? And maybe even more so when you write a memoir, like, why did you want to write this book? And it's a good question. And I've answered it so many different ways, over the last few years. Growing up visibly disabled, you can't really see in the Zoom screen, but my wheelchair's down here. When you grow up visibly disabled, I grew up in the 90s and I just didn't have access to stories like this, like nuanced stories of disability. So in some ways, I think I wrote a book that I didn't have when I was younger, like the stories I didn't have when I was younger. But I also think that I had a lot to process. I had been paralyzed since about the age of 3, and it was kind of an unexamined part of my life story. I moved through the world in a wheelchair, but I hadn't really thought for myself what that meant to me. And so writing is a place I go to understand. And so in some ways, I think I wrote the book to understand what this meant to me. But lately, I think in some ways, the most honest answer feels like these stories were in me, and the book was written because it was ready to be born. It was ready there to be poured out of me. And it feels like not that long ago that I started like writing the first bits of memoir. It started online of all places. And I went to Instagram and created this account called Sitting Pretty, and was just sort of rethinking memories and paying more attention to moments that felt kind of mundane. I had to look back, but I went back to the very first post, and it was about going with my partner Micah to the Arches National Park. And I was just sort of joking about enjoying this majestic nature from the air conditioning of our car, and how glad I was that I'd picked a person who didn't really like hiking either. But pretty quickly, those posts kind of became, I started telling more complicated, vulnerable moments, like what it felt like to struggle to walk with my walker in front of Micah, who was sort of my new boyfriend at the time, like the vulnerability of that act, or sort of documenting the never ending difficulty of trying to find affordable, accessible housing in Kansas City. And I remember even at the very beginning, I was really shocked that anyone cared to read about these things at all. I was just sort of beginning to piece together what those stories meant to me, let alone what, they could mean to anyone else. And that early writing started like 8 years ago now, which is wild. But so much has sprouted from those first little writing seeds that I planted way back when. And like we're having this conversation right now because of those tiny little bits of writing that I did almost a decade ago. And that's a lot to wrap my head around. But I think one of the biggest things that I have learned through the process of writing this book and telling these stories is that while the stories are really deeply personal to me, they're also really not just about me. That the stories of disability are human stories, and I think so many of us are really hungry for true and complicated and honest and hilarious and heartbreaking and wild and ordinary stories of disability. And so that's I hope my book is one contribution to that effort of changing those stories that we have and tell about disabilities. So I don't know. That's some things about the book. If we're ready, I can jump in and kind of read the first excerpt here. I chose. Yeah, does that sound good? Okay, with my like battered copy with a million post-it notes. This book has been some places. So I'll just jump into a section of the book that's from the first chapter. And this chapter opens at a big family gathering. I have a pretty enormous family, and we were kind of just having a family lunch, and I am scooping corn casserole onto my plate, and my brother is there, and my brother David, and he asks me this question, what is your writing about, and what do you hope it will bring to the world? And which is literally what he asked me, because Taussigs don't do small talk, I guess. But I sort of leap from that question to sort of giving this backdrop to my childhood of I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and grew up in sort of this whirlwind of a family. I describe us like puppies in a box that were just sort of playing and falling over each other, and that didn't really change when I got cancer and became paralyzed. My family kind of went on as normal, and I continued to sleep on the top bunk of the top floor of the house, and so this is sort of where we begin, and I will pick up the reading from there. During this window of crawling in the mud and scrambling up to my top bunk, I believed that I was royally beautiful, valuable, and fully capable of contributing to the group. Isn't that interesting to feel the most regal during the days of mud and clamoring and scooting across the floor? I choreographed my own weird, passionate dances, wore frilly dress-up gowns around town, and pretended I was married to the prince. I felt talented and dreamed big. I floated in my own bubble, a universe where everything glistened and glowed, and I wore a crown sparkling with jewels. I believed everything I did, the way I moved my body, the way I looked, the roundabout paths I took, was right. I'd figured out how to do all the things I wanted, and I didn't see my methods as strange or sad. I knew that kids I didn't know stared at me, that adults directed giant, sympathetic smiles toward me, that I prompted tears and applause, but I hadn't yet pieced together that I didn't fit. The fact that I couldn't walk like the kids in my class, that I wore a clunky mess of plastic, metal, and Velcro braces on my legs, used a battered aluminum walker, and sped around on my hot pink wheelchair, didn't really seem worth factoring into my evaluation of myself. At least not at first. It didn't take long at all before I began to believe different things about myself. After only a few years out in the world, going to school, playing at the park and the pool, tagging along with my dad on his Saturday morning grocery runs, a narrative started to take shape before me, a hazy image that sharpened with time. First, I started to see myself as a burden on the people around me. Unlike all the other kids, being with me required alternate routes and problem solving. I saw it everywhere. Hanging out with me meant having limited options on the playground, collaborating with dad muscles to get me into a friend's house, enduring very long bathroom breaks and helping me carry my lunch tray. I calculated that people spending time with me cost them something extra, and I wanted to spare them that high price. Starting around the age of 8, I cut friends out of my life as soon as I sensed my presence caused any extra strain. Soon, I started to believe I was ugly. My body looked so different from the bodies we'd been taught to admire, including my long Taussig nose. I mean, I could have designed a time machine with all the hours I agonized over that thing. There weren't any paralyzed girls or women included in the stories told on screens, through ads, or in magazine pages. I consumed and digested the culture around me and slowly learned with certainty that I was not among those who would be needed, admired, wanted, loved, dated, or married. Not too much later, I began to see myself as weak and helpless too. With the exception of Walmart graders who, according to my child brain, didn't seem to do anything, I didn't see or know disabled people who were employed. I couldn't picture supporting myself with a quote unquote real job or being able to pay my own bills. Most of what I saw of life felt powerfully, intrinsically inaccessible to me. How was I supposed to enter those spaces, let alone contribute in them? My glistening, glowing bubble had deflated into a spot of suds evaporating on the sidewalk. This was not my universe at all. Not only did I discover I wasn't the princess, but I was an uninvited intruder, a problem to push out of sight. This overwhelming history towered behind me as I tried to answer my brother's question still hovering between us. What is your writing about? What do you hope it will bring to the world? My brain froze as my mouth started babbling, trying to synthesize, condense, smooth out the edges of some kind of response I could hand him. Well, I write about disability and lack of representation and the impact of inaccessibility and stigma and unemployment and I was like a woman trying to make spaghetti in the dark, destroying the kitchen as I grabbed every ingredient in the cupboard just in case it happened to be the one I needed. In the midst of my verbal wandering, I inevitably reached for the word shame. The box where I had lived for so very long, the box I still find myself tumbling back into with less provocation than I'd like to admit. This is the shame that attaches so easily to a body that doesn't fit, the shame that buds, blossoms, and consumes when you believe that your existence is a burden, a blemish on the well-oiled machine of society. I tried to explain to my brother how much I want my writing to meet people in that shame, to lift the veil and point to the source, to remind folks that their disabled bodies are not the problem here, to hold up a flag that says, you are not alone. Which is interesting to read in retrospect or after the book came out, because I do think that that writing the book has made me feel a lot less alone. The people that I've been able to meet and the conversations and stories that I've been able to hear from other people after writing the book has definitely made me feel so much less alone.
I think your book, thank you for reading. I think your book and many books like yours provide folks an opportunity of that you realize you're not alone, right? Until somebody else says it, until somebody else is bold enough to share, you kind of feel like, okay, I'm in my own bubble. I'm just going through this. And it's like, no, that's not true. There's people around the world going through similar things. And I think we find ourselves, I, I'll get a little bit into it, but when we start going introspective, it's kind of like the world just, there is no other world outside of what we're going through. But I think you bring a certain light to it. and let folks know, like, no, like, don't fall for that trap, right? Don't
Mm,
to that voice. You're not.
mhm,
So many things going on, and so many people who want to connect, who want to
mm.
share, and there's community and everything. Um, I wanted to ask. I got a lot of things here.
Yay! Let's get into it.
You got to know. Um, some things that really stuck out to me in the first reading, um, is when you talk about being a burden to the people around you, and that hanging
Mhm,
out with you, it came with a price, right?
mhm, mhm, mhm,
Within friendships, relationships, family, there is a price to hang out with people.
mm.
Because you may have that obnoxious uncle, crazy auntie. You may have that little cousin who always wants to eat your snacks.
Mm,
But can you talk to us about, just correct me if I'm wrong, I don't feel like nobody, has someone ever told you that?
mm. Oh, that I would feel like a burden.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't think that that would be something communicated to me in words. I think it would have started as a kid. It would have started with, I think the playground would be a good example. And playgrounds are more and more accessible. I mean, like there's a lot of improvement that has been made to playgrounds since the 90s, but, and we're still working on that. But, yeah, in the 90s, so the playground at school, I think the only thing I could really play was Foursquare on the what would it have been called, the blacktop, and then everything else was in hilly grassy fields and swings that were on top of wood chips, things I couldn't access. And so I never wanted my friends to feel like they couldn't play what they wanted to play at recess, that they would have to be trapped with me, in this corner of the blacktop. And so I think moments like that would be where I would piece together, like, oh, if I sort of pull away, then they'll be free to go play what they want to play. Um, or I think as I got a little bit older and I had my first um, boyfriend, and there would be things that he would be interested in doing or wanting to do, and I would have to grapple with, like, what it meant for him to be dating with a girl who couldn't do those things, and feeling maybe guilt or shame about holding anyone back from the things that they want to do. And I think there are still times when I struggle with that feeling. Um, but I understand it, like today, now. I think especially becoming a mom and having a son, um, who has a mom who has a different set of limitations than a lot of the moms around him. So it's not a feeling that I never experience anymore. But I do think that I have a different framework or context for understanding that feeling. I think as a kid, it felt like um, there's just something so fundamentally insufficient in me, that I need to pull myself away from this person to protect them from my own weakness or failing. And as I've gotten older, it's easier to see, like, oh, playgrounds should be accessible. Like, that's a big shift. Or like, um, even in relationships, it's okay if, like, you do things separate from me, and that doesn't have to mean that we're not close or that we're not compatible. So I think time has shifted my perspective on that feeling, but there are still moments when that can crop up. And it's not because of things that people are saying to me. In my experience, I know a lot of folks with disabilities have had more painful things said to them along those lines. But yeah, for me, it was just piecing things together from my little perch, trying to make sense of the world and my place in it.
No, I hearing you talk about it a little bit more deeper, it sounds like it goes into another point I wanted to ask you about, living in a world that was intrinsically inaccessible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It sounds
Mm-hmm.
like, if the world had already included you, a lot of these things would have not come up. Like,
Right.
and you, like, I can share from my experience, like a black woman with an afro, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many things that I wasn't included in. So I thought that, this, maybe it's me, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
with the sense, like, I thought it was a rite of passage that you had to get a perm. I hadn't seen nobody. with an afro. I've never seen nobody come in very, you sort of, Afrocentric in a way, but
Mhm.
just in what we've been learning and what we've been studying here at the festival and just preparing for this year and just for this talk. And we picked this book intentionally, right?
Mm.
We didn't just pick it because the cover was cute, which is they look great, but
Thank you.
we picked it because we haven't really dived into this. We've been focusing on disability justice and disability rights.
Mm.
And throughout the festival, we've had different pockets and different components, right? But we've never made a full commitment, like many other people have not made a full commitment to really dive into, to really just encompass. Nobody wants to have a one-hit wonder experience.
Mm. Mm.
And just thinking about a world where someone, you can have good intentions, right? You don't want to exclude nobody, but if you really aren't intentional,
Mm.
thoughtful, and you're planning all around,
Mm.
you can have someone feel like that
Mhm. Mhm.
by accident. And you can have good intentions, right? But the feeling has already set in. It's
Mhm.
your intentions don't really make a difference. Not
Mm.
about things that hurt. I appreciate your apology, whatever you want to send me a fruit basket. But it is what it is at this point.
Mm.
Um, and I wanted to ask, you spoke a little bit about finding housing and
Yeah.
finding different things. We're working on a resource day at the festival on the New Haven Green, and we're having different folks come down to for different resources like this. Like if you've been trying to get in touch with a lawyer, if you've been trying
Mm.
with the housing department, can you share a little bit about your experience of just trying to get basic needs that fit
Yeah.
your life?
Yeah, I love that you all are doing that. That's awesome. That's so exciting. To like connect people with resources. I think that's a huge part of the hurdle is that even when there are resources, a lot of times people don't know how to find them or it's confusing how to access them. So like having a hub like that is really an exciting idea. Yeah, so in Kansas City, and I don't know how this compares to New Haven. I would imagine it's not terribly different. Um, it has felt like the options are either um, affordable housing that is entirely inaccessible, or accessible housing that I could never afford. And then also there in Kansas City, there are, um, what would it be called? Like subsidized housing specifically designated for people who are disabled or 63 and older. And the waiting list for that kind of housing in Kansas City, those waiting lists are years long. So trying to find a pocket of shelter in the midst of that kind of dynamic is really difficult. I've moved, I think, 4 times in my adult life. And every time it has felt like I just ended up finding a unicorn of a home. The house I live in now, we moved in here about a year and a half ago. We looked for 2 years for this house. And it didn't feel like the parameters were so picky. I mean, it was like, I need to be able to get inside of it. Um, could it please have 2 bedrooms, one for our son and one for us? Um, and can we please be able to afford it? Like those were sort of the parameters. And we looked for 2 years until we found a house that would work. And this house already had ramps built into it because the woman who lived here before us had the ramps built for her aging dog. So a unicorn, right? Like we found the unicorn house. So I think, I think a lot of cities are in the position of uh, having very limited options for affordable, accessible housing, and accessible housing is so sought after because so many people need it. I mean, it's the experience of living in a body that requires a more accessible home is built into the aging process, right? Like uh, everybody eventually needs a home that is going to be more accessible, and yet the vast majority of the homes built aren't currently. So it's a big problem. And I'm trying to think of what else you asked me about that. It's just it's been a difficult piece. It's a difficult piece of the experience of physical disabilities, figuring out where to live, and even a lot of it is the negotiation of compromises and what can you compromise on and what can't you compromise on. Our bathroom in this house is not accessible, but it was accessible enough, and so that's where we landed.
No, thank you, because I can just, from working, like we've been working with a wonderful advisory committee this year,
Mhm.
helping us. So, Ms. Gretchen, who works at the City of New Haven, I am so sorry. Um, like our Office of Disability Services, Miss Sally Esposito, who used to. Hmm. Okay, actually, let me turn this off so that no one else can call me. Um, we'll come back
It's
to
so
this.
nice that we can edit things. That's nice.
Okay. Um. Yes, the advisory committee. Here we go. Okay. So we've been working with a great advisory committee here in New Haven. Ms. Gretchen, who works at the Office of Disability Services, Miss Sally Esposito, who used to run the office. She used to also do the services at Yale. She now is a part of the Commission on Disabilities for the city. Miss Carmen, she runs the Disability Rights Center in West Haven. Miss Elaine, who is our Triumph activist, singer, songwriter, who herself
Cool.
is disabled and has just gone through so many things. Shannon Tabor from United Cerebral Palsy. They have a lot of assistive tech. I'm getting them shout outs and their flowers. They've been great. But one thing
Mhm.
brought to light and made it on the forefront. You just spoke about Kansas City.
Mhm.
Exactly what's going on in New Haven.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
think for folks watching that this isn't just an area specific issue, that this is a issue that we're
Mhm.
having within this country.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's something that we have to keep pushing, that it's not just you where you live. These
Mhm.
are things that are interconnected in so many different avenues, where it's travel, where it's the
Mhm.
bus system, where it's the housing system, where it's just getting to the doctor, where it's
Mhm.
so many people are building so many beautiful buildings for one or two apartments
Mhm. Mhm.
accessible. Like, just, we really have to get to a place, and it's not really an option, right?
Mhm.
Not
Mhm.
just, oh, that'll be great, we get there when we get there. No, we're really holding back ourselves and our society by not being intentional from the beginning.
Right.
I have to call you after the fact to be like, hey, what do you think about this? No,
Mhm.
we've been there from the beginning. What
Mhm.
so many people talk about diversity and inclusion, but I think folks got to get, it's more than just race, it's more than just gender. There's
Mhm.
that that's being talked about abilities, just so many
Mhm.
different things that you don't know unless you know.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
we can get on into this. But I would love to give you a chance to read the second piece you have.
Yeah. Okay. Now this is taking us in a very different direction, but I chose this bit because it's from the chapter "An Ordinary Unimaginable Love Story," and it's probably my favorite chapter to reread. So I had to pull a bit from here. Um, and up into this point in the chapter, I'm kind of going over my relatively fraught romantic history. I married my high school boyfriend, mostly because I couldn't imagine anything else. I couldn't imagine anyone else wanting to be with me, really. And it didn't go well, which is the spoiler. That's not a spoiler. Um, it didn't go well, so we ended up getting a divorce pretty young, and then I moved into the world of online dating, and that's a whole thing, right? Like figuring out how do I represent disability on a dating app, and there were some strange interactions with dates of people who were like coming up with plans to cure me, or people kind of telling me what disability means to me, things like this. So it wasn't traumatic, but it wasn't the right thing, right? It wasn't a right fit until Micah. I talked about Micah earlier. Micah is my husband now, but I'm going to tell a little bit of the beginning of our love story from this chapter. So we met online. And we sent messages back and forth through the month of September. Messages about birth order, both being the spoiled, angsty youngest, and how much we essentially idolized our older siblings. We each praised the other for pursuing an impractical, soul-nourishing degree in college, talked about our childhood connections to C.S. Lewis and Roald Dahl, and argued over the merits of Team PETA versus Team Gale. Team PETA all the way, obviously. As our messages expanded, they deepened. We talked about longing and grief, suffering and joy, deconstructing and reconstructing our personal beliefs about faith and church and religion. It wasn't until 2 weeks in, on September 13th, that Micah asked me about my wheelchair. Gracefully and with care and curiosity, in the middle of a back and forth thread about pain and empathy, he wrote, "You mention in your profile that you've used a walker and a chair since you were young. Is that something that has taught you empathy? How has it shaped your life? Maybe it's a ridiculous request asking you to fit such a large matter into a typed message, and maybe there's a more polite way to ask. Maybe there's a more polite way to be curious about such a situation. But curious I am, and so I ask." His question, his tone, his word choice delighted me. I treasured his genuine curiosity, not a greedy grab for gory details, but humble interest, an acknowledgement that he didn't know what it meant to me, and he wasn't about to step in and try to fix anything. He simply extended an invitation for me to share my stories. I couldn't have crafted the inquiry better myself. We spent our first date eating giant cookies dipped in big mugs of coffee on a Wednesday night. When I coasted up the ramp to meet him, I don't remember thinking about how he saw me, what the image of my paralyzed body sitting in a wheelchair might mean to him. Why is that? Maybe in that moment, when I saw him sitting alone on the patio of the coffee shop, I trusted that I was already so much more complicated to him than just one wheelchair or one turquoise dress with a lace collar, which is what I had chosen to wear after 3 hours of deliberation. I rolled my hands into a pretend telescope, like I was a pirate sighting him across the ocean, and said, "It's you! You're a real person." We sat under a red umbrella, and I started talking too much, too fast, and he smiled and bobbed his head and chuckled sweetly. Hours passed. I calmed down, and we hadn't even begun to run out of things to tell and ask each other. Even when it started pouring rain, we huddled closer under our red umbrella and giggled at just how wild the storm was getting. Were those actual rivers of water rushing down the street behind us? Our first date was sweet and perfect. Then we had some weird ones, like the moment during the second date when he told me he'd been a real heartbreaker in high school, and I sort of gagged in my own mouth and decided that I probably couldn't ever love him, because who attracts endless love interest in high school of all times? People I can't identify with. Or our third date when he invited me over to hang out with his roommates to watch Hot Rod, and I glared at the TV the entire time because, one, I kind of hate movies where you're supposed to laugh when the characters crash or get smashed by heavy moving objects, and two, Micah's roommates were great and all, but I didn't really want to hang out with Micah's roommates. On one of those early dates, we went thrift store shopping, and Micah confessed he didn't know how to walk with me. "Do I walk behind you? Do I rest my hand on your handlebar?" I didn't know what to tell him, but I liked that he let me in on his uncertainty. "I don't know. How does this feel?" I asked, grabbing his hand and dragging him up the aisle. At first, he didn't want to push me anywhere. To him, it felt aggressive, controlling, the opposite of his driving force. "To me, it sort of feels like we're holding hands," I said. He considered. He hadn't thought of it that way before. And bit by bit, we created our own currency, our own intimacies, our personalized displays of affection. From scratch, we imagined our love to life. Micah pushed my chair by slipping his hands behind my back. He kissed the top of my head while we moved down the street. I rested the back of my head on his forearm. He lifted me out of my chair and into the car to avoid the puddle by the passenger door. I gave him rapid-fire kisses on his cheek and committed his smile wrinkles to memory. So there's a bit of love story for us today.
Thank you. And I'm excited that you shared it, right? Because that specific point in the book was one of my favorite points in the book. And we are doing a conversation specifically on love and dating.
Yay!
Yeah, because it's something that needs to be talked about. Folks
Mm-hmm.
want to know. I really enjoyed how it seemed like you seem to find your love language.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of you gave us a little moment in the thrift store, but can you kind of just kind of walk us through, like, because it sounds like y'all were very open and honest about, like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we know this is different. How is
Mm-hmm.
this going to work from us, and kind of working through those sort of delicate moments.
Yeah, I think that that's um, essential. And the thing is, I think that's essential in any romance or any connection, any sort of connection like that. Um, but with disability, because nothing is assumed, or we don't have an obvious template to follow, we sort of there's sort of a greater invitation, or that invitation is I don't know, more in the forefront to have those kinds of conversations, which I think is great. I feel really grateful that disability kind of pushes us in that direction naturally. So yeah, having to figure out um, like what snuggling looks like, and what like how we greet each other at the end of the day. And later on in the book, I talk more about like sex and how we started talking about what that would be like, or what questions might get. That's the kind of the question that comes up so often with non-disabled people. It's like, how do you have sex? And as in any relationship, that's something um, personal and intimate, and something to sort of figure out together. And we've been able to do that. And it's the same as we've expanded our family, and we have a son now, and we have to kind of figure out like the assumed roles of caregivers and of mom and dad is we're starting from scratch with that too. There's no assumption about who does what, which is great. I love that about us, that we get to sort of build this family system from the ground up based on um, the individual needs and assets of each member of that family. Um, yeah, I guess I would just say lots and lots of ongoing conversations and collaborations between the two of us, because I think that dynamic between two individual human beings is always going to be so singular, um, that it has to be an ongoing, evolving conversation between those people. Um, and just because we decided on something early in our relationship doesn't mean we can't change it. Um, so um, yeah, I think I can't imagine being with someone who was not like down for that. I don't think it would go very far. But I think about it so much, like the way that disability has kind of been um, separated or removed from our ideas about love and romance. Like you think about the overwhelming imagery that we have for those kinds of stories, and how rarely they include disability at all. And I think there's something so profoundly what is the word I'm looking for? Um, like when I picture disability and romance, I picture like what I think all romance needs, which is that starting from scratch, and let's just build what we are to each other. If that makes sense, that's kind of a
No,
different way of looking at it, but
no, it does. It makes perfect sense, right? And I think it does in a sense because I feel like sometimes we try and make things more complicated than they need to be.
mm,
Everything that you said is universal to any healthy
right.
relationship, any sort of companionship. Like God has not blessed me to be married yet, right? But I imagine that if you plan to spend your life with someone, you gotta have a check in every few
Mhm.
years. You're changing, they're changing. You
Mhm.
know, we talked about at 27 ain't really gonna work at 46. We're
Mm.
not the same people we were. This is 20 years later.
Exactly.
You got different needs, you got different wants and things that,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
just kind of open about and have conversations about.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if it isn't weird.
Yeah.
I love love. So how was it just falling in love? Like
Mm.
going through these moments, you found your love language, right? But how was it
Mm.
you were realizing like this is my person.
Yeah.
It, this is who I want to be with.
Yeah. I knew almost immediately. I think even almost like when we were still writing, I was like, well, at first I was like, is this person real? Is this like, are you a real person? Because this is like, you just sort of are a figment of my dreams, right? Um, and I mentioned that like there were a few moments in those early dates when I was like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe you are a real person because this is not what I would have. This is not as easy or as seamless. But yeah, I knew pretty quickly that he was the person, and he did not know as quickly, and so that was like a huge growth period, painful, but like good for me to let him move in his own time and have a whole journey through that love that was like tied to mine but separate. Um, but yeah, I think, what were the things? How did I know? I think I we just fit. Like that fit was so easy, um, but not in like a easy, boring way, but like a easy, energizing way. I have so much respect for the way that Micah's mind works. And so he's the person that I just always want to know what he thinks about any given thing. Um, I think that like communication piece that we already talked about was such a big part of it. It's like there is something incredibly grounding about feeling like you're partnered with someone that you can um, there's nothing you can't look at together or talk honestly about together. Those pieces, I think I knew, especially from my previous relationships, I knew how special that was and rare. Um, and also, I'm just like a quick mover, quick think. I'm like, I know what I want. I see it. And Micah's just ponders and he moves slowly. And so there were a couple of years in the middle where I was like, I know I want to be with you forever. And Micah was like, I don't even know how to use the word forever. And so we just kind of sat in that space for a while of just continuing to love each other and be near each other and let our romance evolve the way that it was going to. And so we've been together over 8 years now. Um, yeah, we have a 3-year-old, but that was like a whole other layer of being with someone is like also now we're gonna like raise a person together. What is that's a lot to negotiate and figure out too, but we're 3 years into that. So yeah, I mean I still will just the other night will like look over at Micah and be like, I can't believe I get to be with you. I feel so lucky to have found you.
That is, um,
It's fun, right? Love can be really fun.
yeah, and I think as it should be, right? It has its
Mhm.
ups, it has its down, but it's little moments like that. Like I feel like that's what folks want, like a dream that is real. That is like no matter what we go through, this is my person. Like I just want to feel lucky to be with you, or just still get butterflies of being around you. Okay, we're gonna end up in a Love Jones moment. If you can share with us the last reading you have for us.
Yes, yes. Okay, here we go. Again, shifting directions. This is from the chapter, um, The Real Citizens of Life. And I think my biggest goal in this chapter was just to look at representation and storytelling. And I think like for people that have a whole range of representation in storytelling, it can be difficult to explain or express the impact and power of a lack of representation or of misrepresentation. Um, so many times in storytelling, in conversations about like representation, I hear people say things like, "It's just entertainment. It's just a story." And I think my goal in this chapter was to bring kind of to show what's at stake in representation and storytelling, and connect that representation to the world we actually live in, to look at how stories that we watch on screens or see on the covers of magazines actually permeate our everyday lived experience. So I talk about different films um, and and representation, and I start to describe the way that it feels like when I move out into the world, those stories follow me. They're written over my body, and people um, place me into a role in a story that I don't necessarily want a lot of times. So this is sort of reflecting on that link between storytelling and how that permeates into our lived world. And I'm going to sip some water before I. Okay, here we go. I live in a culture that uses my form as a symbol, as shorthand, an illustration for something else. Weakness, captivity, and victimization, or super strength, triumph, and feel good inspiration. Even if I do claim a narrative all my own, when I go out in public, I can feel others' stories written all over my body, stories I didn't and would never choose for myself. I feel like I'm speaking the same language, but somehow my words get pulled and picked and sorted until they fit into someone else's narrative. Our stories continually reduce disability into something small, a trinket to manipulate, as if an experience as sweeping, rambling, layered, contradictory, ordinary, vibrant, and human as disability could be reduced to something so one-dimensional. And in case this isn't clear, let me emphasize more is at stake than hurt feelings, irritations, and misunderstandings. Stories written about marginalized people embed themselves in our culture and are used to justify our politics, to arrange our school systems, to determine a hospital's budget. They enter our private homes, follow us into libraries, classrooms, airports, restaurants, courthouses, swimming pools, doctors' offices, churches, bars. These skewed melodramatic narratives shape our cities, our communities, our social interactions. They precede us, follow us, and are almost impossible to shake. When we arrive at job interviews, go to the grocery store, show up at a fertility clinic or adoption agency, create an online dating profile, get pulled over by police, entrust our bodies to medical professionals, pick up our kids from school, enter a place of worship, we are moving through a world where our image is shorthand for something incompetent or unreliable, helpless or dangerous, not worth living or inherently wrong, sinful or contagious, impotent or taboo, perverted or sexless. And these manifest into tangible results, from neglect to hate crimes, condescending laughter to sexual assault, unwelcome prayers to exorcisms, pity to assisted suicides, infantilization to police violence, dismissal to invasive medical procedures, familial rejection to domestic violence, idolization to social isolation. I get it. Movies are entertainment. But these stories connect to thousands upon thousands of personal, painful stories clustered under a very real, oppressive social structure backed by the momentum of hundreds of years. So, yes, let's agree that disabled people are an essential, vibrant part of our world and they deserve to be treated as such. But if we stop the conversation here, if we think this is all there is, we haven't moved much farther than the quote unquote right answer. Diversity and inclusion are good. Don't be mean to disabled people. Inclusion isn't better because it's kinder. We should bring disabled perspectives to the center because these perspectives create a world that is more imaginative, more flexible, more sustainable, more dynamic, and vibrant for everyone who lives in a body.
Mm.
That's a heavy, I just read a heavy section. We totally switched gears, didn't we?
No, but as it's good, right? Because if we don't talk about it now with you, when will we ever be in this chance, this time, this day, right? But what comes to mind is the importance of being in charge of one's narrative, able to advocate for oneself,
Mm-hmm.
not having anybody assume anything over you of what you need, what you want, or what you're into.
Mm-hmm.
And then just listening to you, I thought of Judy Human,
Mm,
the
yeah,
late Judy Human,
yeah,
and I'm trying to, I have questions here, right?
yeah,
But hearing it is much different than reading it.
yeah.
So,
Well, can I just speak really quickly to Judy Human? I,
right?
um, yeah, Judy Human is a for anyone who doesn't know, is a disability activist who was fundamental in kind of um, the activism that sparked a huge change in our country and then eventually the world that led to the Americans with Disabilities Act eventually. And she just passed away a couple of months ago. And in the days after she passed away, um, I I had this like anxiety in my chest that I didn't know how to describe. I didn't know what I was feeling. And I think as I processed that, I think one of the things I was feeling is is the loss of her voice, um, and the command of her storytelling. I mean, she was born into a world where disabled people were not expected to participate in communities at all, right? Like they didn't go to school with anyone else. They could barely leave their house because cities, no curb cuts on the sidewalks, no accessible buses. And she knew, as you were saying, about the kind of like being able to advocate for your own story. She grew up in a world that told her she didn't belong, and she knew that she did. And she demanded that like the rest of the world bend to that story of belonging and inclusion. And I think that losing her voice felt like this feeling of how are we going to hold on to that story without the voice of Judy Human? And I know that she instilled that voice in so many others, and it's not literally this that like the work she's done will disappear with her, but her voice as a storyteller, and I don't think she thought of herself as a storyteller. She was an activist, but the story that she pushed into the world um, countered so much momentum of excluding disability and belittling people with disabilities. And so, anyways, I was just thinking about, as you mentioned her, like that she really has been a huge part of changing the story that we have about what it means to be disabled in the world, um, and yeah, like who we are as a community.
And and I think it kind of pushes like, what do you do when you lose your champion, right?
Yeah.
Everyone kind of has to take up that mantle. And
Mm-hmm.
I used to think that folks like Judy, who have championed so many things, they want us to stand on their shoulders. I had an elder tell me, no, we don't want you on our shoulders. You're heavy. We want you beside us to continue
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing. And I think that's really prevalent in this work, because we're talking, Judy grew up in like the 60s, the 70s. You were right. They want to they were, their idea of inclusion was no inclusion. Like, why do you want to participate? Don't you just want to be in the house? Like, and they're like, no, we want to live. We want to be alive. We have wants. We want to go to the movies too. Um, and that fearlessness, right? That just no, like they took over that building in San Francisco. Like Judy went down there to DC, like, no, we're here. And I
Yeah.
think for the world it was shocking. Like, one, they've never seen this group of people together with
Mhm.
different abilities, and they're also raising hell. Like, stop playing with us. Like,
Yes, 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 yes.
you can't just walk over us. You can't just walk over anybody, but don't get it twisted. Just
Yeah.
because we have going on what we have going on, that doesn't mean that you can just do any old thing to us. And I think Judy was an important person, an important, as you said, a voice. And
Mhm.
you got to really be important. You have to make sure that nobody tells your story,
Mm.
or can assume what you want, assume what you need. Um, I hate when people have meetings about groups and no one of that group is
Mm.
there, of how we're going to save them and how we're
Mhm.
going to help. If you
Mhm.
want to help, that's cool. But there's a way to go about everything. No one's
Mhm.
looking for a savior. One
Mhm.
thing that Elaine talks about, Miss Elaine Kolb, is inclusion. Some folks aren't looking to be highlighted of their own. Folks
Mhm.
really want to be intricate in it. They want to be a part
Mhm.
of it. They don't just want, okay, no, we're going to do this segment at this time with these folks. Let's do this at 12 with these folks. It's just, no, all together. I think those visuals of seeing it all together is what is that world that we're trying to build. Like,
Mhm.
if we continue to think of it separate, and that there's a time for this, a time that, no, the time for everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Who belongs here? Who is in this community? Who do we want here? Who are we building this world for? Who are we like? Who is this all for? All of us.
and even to the point of love stories, to the point of
Mhm.
housing, to the point of employment. We didn't even touch on employment. We'll we'll be here all day talking about
Lots to
employment,
talk.
but
Mhm.
that there's a place for everyone in everything. And even if you have to give accommodations here or change up this situation here, even if you need to put a lactation room somewhere, there's okay, that's fine.
Mhm.
Nothing is too hard if you really want it to be
Yeah. Yeah.
there. And it's not going to stop. There's
Mhm.
people have had different abilities from the beginning of time, and
Mhm.
I don't think there's going to be a change up at any point.
Yeah.
So it's we get with the program or keep having to go back. If you
Yeah.
do something right the first time, you don't have to change it again.
Right. Right. Oh, I feel like my head is gonna like get sore with all my nodding that I'm doing as you're talking. Yes, yes, yes.
Um, I know we're almost to the hour moment. I just wanted to ask you if there's anything that you want to share with us, share with the folks who may be watching, or just anything that's on your heart, your mind, your spirit, and then also how folks can connect with you.
Sure,
And
sure. Okay, I think the last thing I would just say is uh, I am so honored that you all have chosen to read my book and be in this conversation. And I would just say that there are like so many other beautiful, gorgeous books right now that people can read that dig into this experience of disability and from so many different perspectives and intersections. Like I think my story is one of so many. And so I'm like looking around right now, looking for copies of other books. Oh yes, here we go. One that I like can't recommend enough is Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. And these are all, it's a collection of first person essays about disability from every background, every different kind of disability and intersection of identities. And so I just want to point people to other books that are telling these stories. Um, and that's a really great one. We also mentioned, we talked about Judy Heumann, and she has an amazing memoir that people can read too called Being Human. Yes, Being Human is another great one. Kia Brown's book, The Pretty One, is an awesome book. I'm not going to be able to name every book, and I'm going to feel bad about all the ones I'm missing. But there's just a lot of books out there right now, especially that are capturing the depth and breadth of this experience in the world. And we talked a lot about like it being intentional and building a world that includes everyone. And I think one of the ways you do that is by listening to all the different voices in that conversation. So that's what I would say. That's my last thing. And then, oh, you said how people can reach me. I have a website, just RebekahTaussig.com, and my Instagram is still up and around, and that's at sitting_pretty. So yeah, those are probably the ways to find me. So thank you again for having me. And Shaw, I love this conversation with you. I really think we could talk like the end of the afternoon. So thanks for making the time for this.
Of course, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for just sharing being very vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being very honest and transparent about your story, about your work. It's been grateful. I want to give a shout out to Lee, our ASL interpreter, for just being here with us today. We're grateful for you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you for tuning in with us for our One City, One Read kickoff.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope that you learned something, that you expanded your purview, and that you feel prompted to do your own research, to get involved, and just to be aware of what's going on as we work to build an inclusive and accessible world for everyone intentionally. This is not the last hoorah. This is the beginning of our NEA Big Read programming. Join us next Monday, April 24th, at the Mitchell Library for a dive into special education. We have the lovely Kiamari Satillo joining us from the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. She is a parent consultant, and she'll be joining us and giving a really in-depth presentation on special education open to all. Um, Please also check out our website at ouridea/read to learn more about our upcoming NEA Big Read events. And have a great evening.